Hello and welcome. This interview with Zevi Slavin is the first in a series of interviews for the Inner Sense channel to explore body-focused practices from different wisdom traditions. Zevi grew up in a Jewish Hasidic community and became fully immersed in the system of Kabbalistic mysticism. In this interview, he shares some insights specifically from the Kabbalistic system, which views the body as something to be enjoyed rather than something which is dirty or impure. He introduces some of what he calls bodyful as opposed to mindful practices, including cold water immersion and savouring and appreciating the meals that we eat. I hope you enjoy hearing from this excellent teacher, and please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more of this type of information. Thank you very much. It would be nice to hear a little bit about your background, so could we start perhaps with hearing how you ended up teaching and being such an excellent communicator, and maybe to summarize as well the vision or aims of Seekers of Unity?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Let's see. Where do we begin? I grew up in a very religious family, in a Hasidic family, where there was a very specific way that life was lived, in a very beautiful way that life was lived within a very specific community and a very specific rules and functions. Anyone who knows the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidic Jewish community knows how that functions. And somewhere in my mid-teens, I discovered that there were other mystical traditions in other religions, which was quite a startling revelation for me. And instead of seeing them as the other, that one with whom we're in opposition to, there was a bit of a crack in my thinking where I began to see them as journeying perhaps on the same path. And that was a really strange realization to come across. And I saw that through examining them as such, I was able actually to enrich my own understanding and my own practice of my tradition, which was not something which I was trained to do at all. It was very, very much an aberration. I'd always been very studious and interested in studying, and then found a knack in my 20s for teaching while serving in South Africa. I was serving in the Jewish community there. And initially, the teaching that I was involved with is very traditional, teaching classic Jewish texts and sources. That was what my training has been in. Mm-hmm. But then slowly, I wanted to see if perhaps this realization that I had of the shared spirituality, the mysticism of the world's mystical traditions, could also be incorporated into what I was teaching. And that took me a bit of time to explore and develop and think about and talk about with friends and peers and mentors. And it led me to realize the possibility that yes, this can be communicated, and that it is a very healthy step for religion and theology, instead of us each seeing ourselves as independent camps in competition after some ultimate truth that only one of us can win, and either my daddy is the biggest or I'm out of the race. Instead, to see us as a family together, striving for the real, for God, for the good, however it's going to be framed. And it took some time to really go through that, and to go through the academic literature around mysticism and comparative mysticism, the problems and pitfalls and challenges involved in that. I spent quite a while, a good few years, just sitting and reading and chugging through these ideas, and also internalizing them and trying to see where they sat with me. And then eventually I felt ready to, with a lot of convincing from friends and peers and family, to go and begin to try and share this new vision, which ends up being quite an old vision of religion, one which is much more centered around a unified vision of how, if reality itself is fundamentally unified, and that's the basic metaphysical premise, then that is expressed in our experiences, in our theories, and in our practices, and it doesn't have to be done in isolation. So on the channel, we talk about Jewish mysticism alongside Christian mystics and Muslim mystics and Buddhists and Hindus and Native Americans, and it all seems to very seamlessly fit together towards a very beautiful conception of reality, one which seems to be the best way we can live, putting aside questions of truth propositions even. It seems just from an empirical standpoint, the best decisions. And we see this now, which I think is why your work is interesting. We see it also leaking into many other fields, into psychology and physiology and trauma studies and studies about vulnerability, and all these fields kind of converging towards some kind of unified vision. And it's very exciting to be a part of that, and to have been bit with this bug with a love for unity. And so thank you for your kind words. It's something which is very real and alive to me, and something which I hope to continue to explore myself and deepen for myself, and to share with others.
So bitten by a bug, I like that. It's a kind of a quest or a query that you can't put down. It's like a good book. Once you start reading it, you want to keep going. So maybe, how do you define mysticism?
It's a great question. Mysticism is a very contentious term in the academic field today. There are some people who refuse to use the term at all, as other academics who refuse to use the term religion at all. I think it's still a term that can be used. Most definitions of mysticism, a succinct definition is something like the unmitigated or unmediated experience of the real or the ultimate is usually a going, and the word God is specifically left out of that because some mystical traditions don't have God as the ultimate. That's a going definition. There's another definition, a bit more of a prosaic one, which was given by Evelyn Underhill, a great Christian scholar of Christian mysticism. She said that mysticism is the art of the union with the real. It's another quite nice definition. I tend to actually, there's a third definition which I prefer from Peter Moore. It's in the Encyclopedia of Religion, and it's become quite a good definition, I think, which moves the emphasis away from simply experience and takes into two other components. And Peter Moore's definition is that mysticism is unitive experiences, and those can be ecstatic, visionary, contemplative, meditative. There's a whole sort of phenomenology of what those unificative experiences are. There's also two poles of that. There's the sense of nullification and unification, but that's all within experience. Then there's unitive theories. So those are the mythologies, the cosmologies, the theosophies and theologies and sciences and metaphysics that try really to reconcile what the individual or the group experience in that unitive moment with everyday reality, which seems to be made up of multiplicity and division and separation. And in that space, we create theories. Great chains of beings, particularly, is something which comes into effect. Enchanted chains of beings, to use another term that's used. So those are the theories. And I'm actually very interested in the theories of mysticism, particularly in the metaphysics, and in comparing the different metaphysics and to see what we can learn by making those comparisons. And then the third component of Moore's definition is the practices. And that means both the practices that the mystics themselves undertake to try and make the space for those experiences, and the ethical practices which they go forth in their lives, having had those experiences and those knowledge. So the definition that I use when it comes to mysticism is unitive experiences, theories, and practices.
Unitive theories, experiences, and practices. Okay.
Yeah, usually experiences is put first. There's believed to be something that originates in the experience, which is then worked through in theory and then put into practice, and that loops back. But they were not really divorced from, to separate these into three different things would be a mistake as well. They're really very much interconnected.
And when, just for clarity, unitive, what are we uniting? Are we, you kind of touched on that with some of the theories that unite the fragmented world. So can you give a couple of examples about, maybe from your own experience during a practice or an experience, what do you feel is being united? Yeah.
So when we try to give broad definitions that need to encompass everything in the world, which we call mysticism, we try not be specific about what exactly is being united with or what's being experienced in that, because we try to leave it open. But to give a few options at least, which opens up some space for some major typologies of mysticism. Generally, one good way of framing mysticism, which often mystics themselves do, is to frame it in the negative. So what happens is that the sense of separation between the subject and the object, the ego and the other or the world around them, that boundary and border between those things, that dissolves. And what happens in that space is you see these two directions. Either there's a sense where the self, so if we imagine this wall between the self and other, or self and world, and that wall comes apart. So either the self, the conception of self, flows out onto everything, and we turn to the world and we say everything is us, it's all us, in Hinduism we say tattvamasi, that thou art that. Whatever you encounter is just really you. Or it can go the other way, where if that wall comes down, there's an implosion of the self, and there's no self. And that's for example in Buddhism, the doctrine of anatman, where there's the self is entirely an illusion. Everything is just spontaneously arising, is a classic Buddhist doctrine. But the sense that there is the basic categorical separation that we maintain in our experience is the separation between what I consider, what I identify with as me, and then what I identify with as not I. And that's why we call it an ego death. That sense of separation is what falls away. And when we can expand our sense of identity, what we're doing as well is we're expanding our sense of belonging, our sense of care, our sense of compassion. And that's a very radical shift that happens in the mystic's experience. So I think instead of saying what is the object to which we are uniting, right? It's sometimes how we think about it. We're uniting to a specific form of God, or I think that language is something which the mystics themselves won't like, because they want to get beyond this dichotomy of subject and object, where everything that is simply becomes united, and therefore we speak about being united with reality as it is. So I think it's better to emphasize on what's lost in that experience, as opposed to what object is being united with, and what's being lost is the very distinction between subject and object. If that's helpful.
Yeah, that is helpful for me, and I can see why in that case the theory, the experience, and the practice are all needed. Because if it was just the theory alone, then you would have to, through sharing language or trying to record the theory, then you have to kind of choose objects and choose things which kind of divide or create concepts. Whereas from what I hear you saying, if we're trying to avoid specific examples and make it an experience, then that has to be experienced, doesn't it? It has to be felt through some sort of practice, perhaps. Okay, so that's a great introduction, thank you, and really good to kind of establish a few of the points about mysticism and what it means to, or might not mean, to unite. So the interviews on this channel, the Inner Sense channel, are really to help people make sense of their bodies and how our bodies fit in with the world around them, and specifically how our felt sensations. So we may feel, something like hunger or breathlessness or excitement. We may call them emotions, but they're sensations arising from inside us. How they relate to how we manage our daily affairs in the outside world. Now, I don't really know anything about Jewish mysticism particularly, or as I understand it from some of your videos on Seekers of Unity, then there's that it encompasses lots of different practices. But one of the videos that I watched, it talked about, you had the kind of framework that involved sensing, feeling things into different body parts. So could you perhaps share any practices from Jewish tradition that involve turning our attention inwards, and especially paying attention to the bodily sensations rather than only the thoughts?
Yes, certainly. So there's something to clarify here, which is that there's a conception that people have about Judaism that it's very cerebral and very disembodied. And I'm not saying that there isn't some reason for that perception. The Jews are known as the people of the book, right? There's a sense that the Talmudic dialectic, the rabbinic mind, is really the great achievement of Judaism. But what we forget is that when we talk about religion in a contemporary Western world, we're using a very Christian and specifically Protestant understanding of what religion is. Religion means for us, for most people, for non-academics and scholars, means that, ascending to certain propositions about the nature of reality, about God, about salvation, about redemption. And to then apply that label religion to something like Judaism would be a fatal mistake, which is why I mentioned earlier that some academics choose not to use the label religion at all, because it takes certain assumptions from one religion and puts them onto something else, which we're calling religion. In Judaism, there is no word for religion. The modern Hebrew word for religion, dat, has to be made up when the modern Hebrew dictionary is being written, borrowed from an early biblical term, but there is no word for religion because Judaism never self-conceptualized as a religion. And it was never about professing to certain beliefs in the mind that make one therefore a good Jew in accordance with, and therefore they're saved. One of the greatest ironies in the history of Jewish theology is that the perhaps the most influential Jewish philosopher of all times, the 13th century sage Maimonides, gets called he gets called a heretic for trying to formulate 13 rules by whom could be called a heretic. And the rebuttal was, right? The rebuttal was that Judaism has no such rules, and he's called a heretic for trying to make rules about who would be a heretic. The point being basically is that in Judaism we don't have these rules that this makes you have to believe this or you're a heretic, and if you don't, you're not. And it's a very interesting history of the reception of Maimonides, which can leave to another time. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if we think about Judaism simply as a religion in Protestant terms, that it's about believing in X, Y, Z, then we miss the point. Judaism is a way of life. Mm-hmm. And Judaism is about taking one's way of life and doing it in a certain way, in accordance with a certain covenant that's made, in a certain relationship. It's living in a relationship. And therefore, it's everything that we do that is done in that relationship. In Judaism, the term that we have for Jewish law is halacha. Halacha literally means the path upon which we walk. In that everything that we do, every step we take on this path of life, there is a Jewish way to do it, because that's what it is. Because it's an all-encompassing. You're not Jewish on a Sunday or a Saturday. You're Jewish from the moment you wake up to the moment you die. And therefore, the way that Jews eat and breathe and walk and make love and see themselves and exercise and dance and smell and touch and are sick and are healed, these are all the way we're born and die. These things are all done in a Jewish way, and therefore there's a real, not just an embodiment of Judaism, there's a real enlivedment where it fully encompasses our entire being, and where the mitzvot, the connections within Judaism, the way that we connect to God, are more often than not done with the body, right? It's hard pressed. There are few mitzvot at all through the commandments, as it's sometimes translated, that are simply done in the mind and the mind alone. Very, very seldom is that the case. So we can, if you'd like, we could go into some of the ways that Judaism goes about doing these everyday normal things. There are also religious things on top of that. The way that we pray, the way that we dip in a bath of fresh water for ritual purity, the way that we fast. These are also embodied practices. But I think it's important to recognize that even the way that Jews eat and sleep and make love and tie their shoelaces, these are all encapsulated within a certain framework of doing that. And so I think it's important to realize that the religion of Judaism encompasses every human aspect. And then there are also what we typically see as religious things that are on top of that, things like prayer and devotion and worship. And I'd like to get into both of those categories if we have the chance to.
Excellent. Yeah, please do. So it's a way of life. It's a way of being that it's not just during the time that you say, right, I'm going to spend half an hour now doing my practice or religion. It's to be used throughout every moment of the day. And I was surprised to hear you say actually that it's the majority of it is through some kind of embodiment rather than just mental practice. So yeah, please do cover both.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it is surprising, and I think it's important to have these conversations to be able to change our perceptions. There's a third, perhaps to set things on for the later in the conversation. There's a third question here, which is really the more of a theoretical or metaphysical question about how is the body conceptualized in Judaism? How is the body seen? And that also may be something which is quite a shock, where the body in Jewish mysticism, based on the first verses of Genesis, is actually seen as not a place of impurity or dirt or filth or decay. It's seen rather as a mirror of the divine. It's seen as a manifestation of the image of God, because Adam is created in the image of God in Genesis. And then when we get into Jewish mysticism with the Sefirot actually placed, they're embodied within the human body, each one given a different body part. And we can get into more of the theosophical, metaphysical parts, which is definitely a topic of my interest and passion. But let's begin with what we would consider the mundane. And the basic point of Judaism is that none of these things are inherently mundane. They're mundane if we make them as such. And they're only mundane if we do them without being aware of them. And here's an interesting point, and you may be more of an expert when it comes to this sort of duality that I'm going to introduce, where we talk about mindfulness, right? But there's also a term which is bodyfulness, right? And to think of them in separation from one another is a big mistake, right? Because what we're doing there is we're creating a division and duality. And what we're looking for, we are seekers of unity. So the understanding is that when we are being mindful, we have the capacity to be bodyful. And when we're being bodyful, we have the capacity to be mindful, because those are really two sides of the same coin. So the difference between making an act, an ordinary act, the difference between making it mundane, profane, or sacred and holy is if we're able to bring attention into our bodies of what's happening. And this is what is directed in Judaism. So let's begin with eating. I'm actually going to give credit to this order that I'm going to run through things here, to Jay Michelson. Jay Michelson is a friend of mine and a scholar who wrote a great book called God in Your Body. And he runs through these topics. If anyone wants to further deep dive, please do check out his book. It's available on Amazon. So the way that Judaism prescribes engaging in something so ordinary as eating is and drinking is there's an imperative to bring our intention to it, and we do that by speaking words. Judaism has a very big emphasis on invocations, on saying something, because when we stop and say something, it gives us a chance to reflect on what we're doing. So when we have a drink of water, we make a bracha. We say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvaro, and then we drink. Typically, we don't say God's name unnecessarily, but for the purposes of chinuch, of education in Jewish law, we're allowed to, which is why I did that again. So, and these blessings are very beautiful. They're very poetic, and that poetry is supposed to stop us and arrest us in our movement. So we say we thank God, the Master of the universe, by whose word everything in existence comes into being, and then we take a small sip of water, realizing that this tiny sip of water is part of a huge cosmic dance, which is constantly brought into being by the Logos, by the word of God. And when we eat and we pay attention to the way we're eating, after we stop to make a blessing, to realize that this food doesn't just come to us, that this food is here brought to us by the graciousness, by the bounty of nature, and by all the people involved in bringing it to us, bringing our attention and our awareness to the farmers that made the food, to the drivers who delivered it to us, to the store packers who put on the shelves for us, all the way till it finally made it to our plate. Sometimes we forget that it ever had to go through any process to get there. And that is the first part of the command, which is v'achalta, to eat mindfully, to be aware of what's happening, and to feel in one's body that food going in is the second step, which is v'savata, to feel the satiation, to feel the energy coming into one's body. I think we so often don't get a chance to feel this, but in Judaism we fast 5 times a year, and after you've fasted for a full day, when you put food into your mouth, you feel the nutrients coming back into your body like a parched piece of earth that's being filled with fresh water, and you feel the sugar running into you, which is an incredible experience to be present to feel that energy flowing through your veins, realizing that we're not other than nature. Nature is made up of its own veins and roots and branches, and as are we. The Torah compares the person, the human, to the tree in the field, and feeling that experience is the second step. So eating, and then v'achalta v'savata, and the third one is uveirachta. After we eat, right? So when we make the blessing initially to eat something, what we're really just doing is making space for permission, asking God permission to partake in God's world and the bounty that there is. After we're satiated, the commandment therefore is to give thanks, to be in gratitude for now having the capacity to feel that food inside of us and to nourish us, and to be aware that there's so many people in the world that don't have that opportunity, and to be aware that we need to try and do what we can to make sure that everyone can be in a state where they feel satiated. That's taking something very simple. You could eat very simply. You could wolf down a burger. You could be answering an email while you're doing that and not even think about it. Or you could stop. You could be present. You can make a blessing in an ancient tongue that brings you into the moment, that makes you grateful for how the food came to you. You could feel the food coming into your body and feel how it fills you. And then after you've eaten, to give forth gratitude. And it's a whole, you take what could have been an ordinary activity and you make it into something sacred. And that's done by imbuing it with the sacrality. And the same thing happens with the way that we do any physical act. There are so many people that look from the outside might think that it's a bit crazy, but the intentionality that's brought specifically with speech, to be able to feel what's going on in the body. And there are other great examples, but I think food is particularly one good example. And I might pause there to allow this to be more conversational than just a monologue.
I really like that, and I can see so many parallels to the different layers or aspects of that practice of eating you just talked about. So one is the kind of the slowing down, the pausing, um, so that we're not just distracted by everything going on. Then you've got the gratitude, so giving time to be grateful for how the food ended up in front of you, whether that's through the producers of the food or the cooking process. And then you've got the feeling aspect, so feeling it entering your body. And I'm guessing there's a bias towards pleasant feelings rather than unpleasant feelings. So I guess that's assumed. Mm-hmm. And then finally, you've got another layer of gratitude afterwards. The reason I sort of questioned or assumed it's you'll sort of have a lean towards pleasant sensations. I'm reminded of, I recently read a book by a guy called Sadhguru. I don't know if you've come across him. It's called Inner Engineering. And he started off that book by saying that the goal of all the practices he's talking about is to arrive at a pleasant state. So with the practices you're just describing, is that the goal? Is that to feel something pleasant, or is it to be unbiased and maybe just to notice what's happening without any striving towards a certain state?
That's a very interesting question. There is a strong idea in Judaism that we thank God for both that which we perceive to be the good and the bad. For both of those, we thank God. And they're the same blessings that we say for our health. There are parallel blessings that we say for someone who's ill. Realizing that ultimately anything that God or reality or nature, whatever you want to call it, brings to us is ultimately for a good reason. And embracing that, embracing both the tov and ra, both what we call good and bad, is a very strong Jewish idea. There's obviously there's a desire, particularly when it comes to the other, that we don't want the other to suffer. But there is a notion in the Talmud of the Kabbalah to accept one's own suffering with love. There's a notion that this is a strange notion, but in the relationship between God and the individual, there's a sense that sometimes, and this may sound a bit masochistic, there's a sense that one would rather, and when I use the word God here, I want people to replace that word for themselves and whatever with whatever word works for them. That could be reality, being, nature, whatever works for them, a cosmic consciousness. So there's a sense that when we're in relationship with God, it's worse to feel nothing at all than to feel suffering, because this is what the Talmud says. The Talmud says, "Ashrei ish asher tasrenaka," that lucky is the person who feels the suffering from God, because there's a sense that there's a relationship there that we have with reality, with nature, that isn't always pleasant and cheery and roses, but sometimes that involves suffering. And when we're aware of that and we can embrace that and feel it as part of our relationship to the rest of being, then that's something which is embraced. Of course, we try to emphasize the gratitude on when things seem to be working properly. Part of the eating, which we sometimes forget in contemporary society because of how we separate these two things, but part of the process of digestion is then to excrete the parts of the food which our body couldn't absorb. And this, some people may find this bizarre, but in Judaism, there's a blessing that one says after performing a successful excretion of those extra parts. It's a very beautiful blessing where we thank God for allowing all the parts and all the mechanics of our body to work well, to work in harmony. And we say that if one of the valves or openings or channels was blocked or ruptured, we wouldn't survive very long. So we recognize that we would like to survive, we would like to live and flourish, and we thank God for when that's working well. But when someone passes in Judaism, which is also a very bodily experience to pass, and we don't hide the body away in Judaism, we're present with the body, we stay with the body until the body is buried at all hours. When someone does pass away in Judaism, we don't rent our hair and gnash our teeth. We say another blessing, right? Which is Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is God who is the true judge, who judges honestly. So we realize that if it's our time to go as well, and if it's the time for the body to go back into the nature's process of decaying, it's not something that we shun or we hide away from. We again realize that this is part of the true benevolent guidance of nature itself. So there may be a positivity bias, but we don't ignore or shun the bad. We in fact thank God for what we perceive to be as bad as well.
So a lot of acceptance of suffering, and also even the death process. I'm thinking now about how we bring that back to research around interoception and neuroscience. And there's a lot of excellent work in recent years being done around understanding emotions and how felt bodily sensations relate to emotions and what role they might have from an evolutionary point of view for our survival, to help us, determine whether something is useful or helpful, or whether it's a threat or not. So an example of that might be, a small amount of anxiety or fear can help liven the body up and make us more attentive to our what's going on around us, or even pleasant sensations such as joy and love can really help us connect with other people and form packs of people and bonds and families and keep them together. Do you, in what you just described, this kind of acceptance of the good, the bad, and the ugly, is there a kind of a labeling or a purpose or a reasoning given to different states? If they're all acceptable, do we how do we interpret or make use of these changing sensations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that to accept something doesn't mean to be oblivious or to be uninterested in what's happening, right? There's one state of relation to our bodies, to our sensations, where we're in a state of rejection, right? Where we're not willing to hear or listen what's going on. And in that there could be fear that blocks us from being present to what our bodies are communicating to us. And they always are. And part of that as well is living in societies where we're not taught necessarily to listen to our bodies. What accepting doesn't make one indifferent to what's going on in the body. It makes one realize that whatever is going on is okay, and it's part of nature, it's part of the natural process. And I can be attentive to it from a place of acceptance and compassion and openness. I don't have to stand in fear or anxiety towards what's going on in my body. And part of that as well is a lot of the religious language that we've been raised with in Western society about how the body is dirty, is fallen, is ugly, is sinful, is just the locus of temptation, makes us really want to distance ourselves from our body. And I think that filters in even to modern secular society. Mm-hmm. This Jewish notion that the body is not unholy, the body is not ugly, the body is not disgusting and gross, but the body is a place of holiness. The body is the temple, which mirroring the temple in the desert, a very close analogy that's made between all the parts of the body, the ribs corresponding to the beams of the temple, the heart corresponding to the tabernacle, all the different aspects. So when we have this vision as the body as a beautiful thing, as a sacred thing, as a holy thing, we can then be in a state of acceptance to what the body is coming to tell us. Not acceptance that just means that we're not going to, whatever comes and we don't pay attention, but it's an acceptance which allows us to be present and to pay attention. There is specific associations which we can get into between parts of the body and parts of the psyche, where there's sort of a map that's created between both of them that unites them, and that might be an interesting point. But I hope that sort of cleared up what I meant by acceptance.
Certainly, yeah, really good distinction or clarity about acceptance versus just being neutral or nonchalant about what we're feeling. So yeah, please do go onto this the map of bodily feelings and the relation that to the psyche.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting idea. So in the beginning of Genesis, God creates Adam and Eve in the image of God. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Which is interesting. Just to pause for a second on the verse, God says in the plural, "Let us make mankind in our image." Right? We typically think of God as the singular, right? Not as a plurality. Most people don't think that the Bible has a pantheon of gods who are doing the creating. Therefore, who is this plurality? And there are many answers given throughout rabbinic literature of who is the plurality. One very beautiful one that I came across recently is that God is actually is speaking to nature as a whole. God is speaking to the trees and the birds and the oceans and the rivers, which all, according to the biblical narrative in Genesis, pre-exists the creation of Adam and Eve, which happens on the sixth day, and all the rest of the world and all of the inhabitants, the birds, the insects are all there already in the first 5 days. And therefore, God says to them, to nature itself, let us create mankind in our image, in the image of God and nature, which unites those two in the human body. We have both the natural and the divine together. That's just a small aside. But the way that the Kabbalists read this, because it's a very perplexing passage for many, many Jewish thinkers, right? What is does God have an image that mankind can be created in, right? When God explicitly says in later books of the Bible, in the book of Exodus, that there is no image, do not make an image of me, right? So what is this image of God? So there's an answer which is given by many rationalistic Jewish philosophers, such as Gaon, Maimonides, and others, that the image of God is either God's capacity for speech, for creation, for intellection, and the human, unlike the rest of the animal kingdom, has the power to speak or self-reflect or self-consciousness, and that is the image of God. And that's one answer given. The Kabbalists give a whole different answer, which in their way is very rich and mythological, and there's a lot of world building going on. So you have to hang in with me for a second. The Kabbalists have two notions of God. There is God in God's hiddenness, the Ein Sof, the infinite God, the infinite one, the Deus aspicandus in Latin. Not that they use the Latin term. And then there is God as God reveals God's self to create the world. And the way that God reveals God's self, according to the Kabbalists, is through 10 modalities, 10 creative channels called the Sefirot. I'm not going to get too deep into this. We've done a lot of material on the channel explaining what the Sefirot are, and I recommend people check that out. But the Sefirot are a process of creation, a process of expression and relation that begin in Keter, in the subconscious or in the superconscious, and flow all the way down to the last of the 10, which is Malchut, which is either speech or action or materiality, depending on what frame we're speaking. And what's very interesting about the Sefirot here, and I hope this point makes sense, is that the Sefirot are really a schema, a map that maps God's creative and relational process to the world, maps the world itself as it is, made up of these 10 energies and modalities that are in balance with one another between left and right and up and down. And then they're also the map of the human body. So there's a very famous text, Patach Eliyahu, a section from the Zohar, the most well-known book of Jewish mysticism, which maps each one of the Sefirot onto a different part of the human body. Mm-hmm. And that, says the Kabbalists, is what it means that mankind was created in the image of God. The same way that God chooses to manifest in the image of these 10 Sefirot. It's like this, people may recognize the image, it's the tree of life image, yep. which goes back and forth. So too the human is made on the image of those 10 Sefirot, where the first 3 Sefirot are in Keter, is actually beyond. It's the crown which sits above the skull. Okay. It's outside of the human. It surrounds the human. Then we have Chachma and Bina, which are the first 2 cognitive or intellectual faculties, which are split into left and right hemispheres. We have Dat, which sits in the neck. And some people who know Eastern mysticism may see some parallels here. We have Chesed. Yeah, there are some parallels there, which are interesting. We have Chesed, which sits in the right arm. We have Gvura. Chesed is loving kindness, is embrace, is acceptance, is saying yes to life. We have Gvura, which sits in the left, which is to push away, to create distance and boundaries, to say no. And those 2 energies are always needed. Mm-hmm. We have Tiferet, which sits in the solar plexus, which is the harmony of those 2. When we find the perfect balance between saying yes and saying no, between allowing and forbidding, that's when we feel in the chest a sense of serenity and completeness. That is Tiferet, which is part of the central axis of the Sefirot, aligned with Dat and Keter. Then we have the 2 legs, which are right leg again, corresponding to the right arm, is Netzach, is conquest, is victory, is ambition, is going out to challenge. And Hod is the left leg, which is to kneel, to be submissive, to be humble, to take a bow. That's in the left leg. And when those 2 are united, which happens in between the legs, is the place of Yesod, the place of connection, the place of intimacy, which is where we as humans are able to unite with another human once we find that balance between needing to dominate and being able to submit. When we find that in a relationship, we are able to build a connection of Yesod, of intimacy, of connection. And finally, Malchut is what comes out of that, is what's born from that process. And because we have this very complex map, which I just ran through very, very quickly, maybe too quickly, of things that go on inside the body, we can feel into that process and we can work to unite that process, where we can take the right channel, right? The Chachma, Chesed, Netzach, which is outgoing, which is commanding, which is reaching out, and the left channel, which is Bina, which is analytical, which is internal, which wants to hold back, which is submissive. When those can be united within our body, we can feel that centering in us all the way down from above our heads, through our spine, through down to our pelvis. That is one way of the unification that happens, of the lateral and the horizontal unification, when we can unite what's going on cognitively through dot, through our necks, metaphorically, into our chest, into our emotions, down into our legs, and into our pelvis, which is our expression going into the world. So a lot of the work of the Kabbalists is about seeing the human body as the body of God, as the microcosm of the world, which is the macrocosm, and learning to feel into those very complex dynamics and balance and process of feelings, so that we can learn to unite ourselves internally. And this process is I think is an incredibly bodily one, and I think that's interesting.
Certainly is interesting, and thank you. You've covered a lot of ground in there, and I could ask lots of questions about that. I should have a whole session just on that one. How do you pronounce it again? The Sefirot.
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 Yes.
One thing I would like to ask about that, the left and the right. So the right is more the action oriented. Is that correct? And the left, what was the left was more the receiving, or accepting?
Yeah. So there's a few ways of sort of painting out this picture, and there's something more intuitive about it than necessarily categorical and definitive. And once one gets a sense for what unites what's going on the right channel, which incidentally is the masculine channel for the Kabbalists, and what's going on the left, which is the feminine, the anima and the animus, which can be united. So the right generally, there's a sense of expansiveness, of openness, of giving, of conquest, of knowledge, of creativity, is generally associated with the right. The left, and this may be counterintuitive for the way that we perhaps think about masculinity and femininity. The Kabbalists have their own conception of what these categories mean for them, which may not be a 21st century conception, and that's okay. The left is much more analytical, is much more detail oriented, is much more restrictive, is much more boundary oriented, is much more able to receive and to submit and to hold space for other. Where right is could be overpowering and overbearing. Left is much more pulled in. A good way of thinking about it perhaps is metaphor that's used sometimes is acceptance and rejection, where the right accepts, the left rejects, and those are both really important.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting how as I'm listening to you, I'm trying to sort of see similarities with other in other traditions. So more the Oriental, the yin and yang, for example. I know a few I practice dry needling acupuncture myself, but there's other people who've got a much greater depth than me of knowledge, and they have this sort of the yang energy and the yin energy, and that can be often explained as being in different sides of the body. I spend about 80% of my sort of time doing manual therapy with people. And in the manual therapy world, there's a lot of talk about left and right side of the body. My personal experience, and this is going to lead on to the next question, is that can vary from one person to another. So it's, in the same way that not everyone is right-handed. Some people are left-handed, or some people lead with, their dominant leg is left versus right. So do you think this left and right, is the map just to be seen as a kind of conceptual framework, or is it a universal rule for every human's body?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that there sometimes is, when we create maps, right, which are trying to include a lot of things in them, sometimes they can be a bit totalitarian. And the Kabbalists themselves speak about a phenomena where the sefirot, or the attributes on one side of the body, can actually be switched. They can be replaced. The Kabbalists call this hechlifa duchtai, where they change their places in Aramaic, which may be the case that for someone their gvura is where their chesed is ordinarily, and vice versa. And I think the analogy you brought is a very good one, where someone could just be, dexterous in their left hand and not the right hand. And the Kabbalists definitely do recognize that there is a possibility for changing, and this map is just a generalization, and is not case specific as in any generality.
Okay, great. And I've heard people who study acupuncture in much more depth than me. This is a map, by the way, of all the meridians on a human body from acupuncture, and they say they can actually move as well. So even though the Chinese tradition has gone through for thousands of years, has created this map, they do acknowledge that they can move and deviate, or if someone's had an injury or a piercing or something, then the meridian can shift. Fascinating stuff. Okay, so then do you have a favorite practice yourself, or an example of a practice that you've given eating, which is one, but do you have anything that's I've heard you talk about the use of sound and singing and maybe chanting, that you can share, just to give people another example of a practice that involves bringing attention into the body?
Yeah. There is a practice which comes to mind. There are many. We could speak of many, but one of them particularly is coming up for me, which is there's a practice called Mikveh, which is bathing, and there's a very specific context around it. It begins in temple times, when people had to be ritually pure to enter the temple to bring sacrifice. And there are certain things which make one ritually impure, particularly contact with death is something which creates ritual impurity because of the importance of life, which is an interesting point for itself. But ever since the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, the mikveh practice wasn't kept up in mainstream Judaism. But besides for women, in which case there is a monthly mikveh practice, which is very sacred and special to them. But I actually would rather let a Jewish woman speak about their experience and not me speak on behalf of them. But insofar as the mystical tradition goes, the practice of mikveh, of bathing it's a very technical bathing that needs to happen. There needs to be 40 measurements of water, 40 sa'ah of water, which is a specific rabbinic measurement. The water has to be directly from the rain. It kind of passed through a catchment before being in the basin where it is now. And there's all kinds of ways that is facilitated that the water can get there directly. It has to be what's called mayim chayim. It has to be living waters, or waters that are still alive. Raw waters is really the idea. Or it can be fresh from a spring, an ocean. These are all permissible forms. But once it's been contained and stagnated, it's no longer kosher for mikveh. So mikveh, although it fell out of practice in temple times, particularly for the male population, it was taken up again by Jewish mystics throughout the ages as an extra way to go ahead and try and purify themselves and bring intentionality. And one of the specific meditations for me that I find when I go to mikveh, and mikveh is sometimes done on Friday before Shabbat, which is the Jewish day of rest. Sometimes it's done every morning before prayers in the morning, which is also a very bodily experience, which we could speak about. Most people may not think about prayer as bodily, but there's an oft-quoted verse from the book of Psalms where King David says, let all of my bones and joints cry out in prayer, God who is like you, where the body itself is in its motions is calling out. There's a dance, there's a pronouncement, there's the sound the body itself makes is praising God. But putting that aside for a second, which is in the realm of prayer, in the realm of mikveh, in the realm of dunking in this water, and there's all different kinds of meditations and numbers and computations that go into it, which I'll put to the side for a second. Firstly, something which is interesting is that the mikveh is done completely naked, and it's generally not done alone. It's generally done in a communal experience where there's many men going to mikveh together, which in the Western world we're not used to seeing many naked men together. In other traditions, it's still very common. But the sense of the shame that we have about the male body, or about the body in general, including the female body, is something which the mikveh very much unconsciously works to allow us to feel comfortable, of people of all shapes and sizes, of all colors, dunking in water together. And in the water, we're all the same. But one of the most beautiful aspects of the mikveh, for me at least, is a metaphor, or a certain intentionality which is brought, which can very much be felt in the body. that when one goes underwater, what's happening is along with many things happen when you go under the water, but one of the things that happens is that you can no longer breathe underwater, right? We're not fish, which means that if you stay there, and if you go into very cold water, which is something which was practiced by Jewish mystics in Eastern Europe, the water actually takes your breath away, right? It's a natural reaction, which no matter how many years of training in freezing cold water, the breathlessness that cold water brings to us is a natural reaction. And when the breath is taken from us, breath in Judaism is life. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim is the words that describes God breathing life into the nostrils of Adam and Eve, that he blows life into their nostrils. So the breath is human life. And when we don't have our breath, when we're disconnected to our breath, we're in a state of potential death, where if we stayed in the mikveh for long enough, you would be dead. And the imagery that's brought is of the child in the womb of the mother, that the child is surrounded in the waters of the mother. And there's a relationship between the 40 days of conception and development of the embryo and the 40 measurements of water and the 40 days of the flood. With Noah, there's a very rich imagery that connects these moments together, the moment of the child in the womb, the moment of the global purification during the flood, and the purification of the individual in the mikveh. And what happens is that we're able to visualize our bodies being held in the womb of nature, in the womb of this mikveh, which is often made out of stone. There's a very natural feel to it.
Wow.
And what we allow ourselves to do is in this meditation is we allow ourselves to feel our body sinking to the bottom, to visualize all of that parts of us which we don't want to be. We allow that to stay in the water, to sink to the bottom, and to peacefully pass on. And then what rises from the water is a new reborn child coming fresh out. And we allow ourselves to not allow ourselves to be defined by who we were when we went into the water, but we can be a new person coming out. And it's a tremendously bodily experience. You're naked, you're cold, you're wet, you feel the water embracing you and holding you, you feel yourself adjusting to the water, and you feel your body almost being separated into two, the body that you leave behind and the new body that you come out with. And that's also a great example of the relationship between being mindful and being bodyful, right? When we bring our attention to what's happening in our body, in the experience of nudity, in the experience of wetness, in the experience of coldness, we're able to be aware of what's going on and allow ourselves to create a new narrative for us through what's happening in our bodies. So there's both this top-down and this bottom-up effect, and which allows us to emerge fresh and reborn. And that's one ritual out of many, which I think where the body plays such a central role.
Great. Yes. I like that, you've got that idea of, you said it's in a stone kind of bath or bathing area. So you've got that womb, which gives the idea of being supported, nourished. You've got the cleansing aspect. So the water has to be very pass through sort of rigorous testing. And then there's the ritualistic bit of the idea of letting go of things which may have been bothering us before that practice. And then the cold temperature, which is a little bit of discomfort and suffering. And from a kind of, I've heard about a friend of mine who's Sikh, and she said in Sikh tradition, they've got some cold water rituals as well. Of course, we've got modern day Wim Hof is very popular with his cold water therapy. And having practiced that myself, I know how refreshing and reviving it is. It is. But from a biology point of view, we've got these and psychology and neuroscience, that the cold water shock stimulates so many things in the body, these heat shock proteins, or we could say cold shock proteins, that then give the body it switches our physiology around a little bit. And the whole idea of that visualization again will have an impact on the body. So fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And any other like practices that you want to share? Any that you think might be particular of interest to people who are interested in body awareness in general?
Yeah, I think there's a notion where there's a focus on the totality of being in many Jewish practices, where sometimes we do a practice that only engages one specific part of the body, right? So we blow the shofar. We're coming up to almost a month away from the Jewish New Year, where we blow a ram's horn. It's a very raw, very primal activity, and it's supposed to be the sound of a crying child as well, like a very raw image. And that we engage, the person who's blowing is engaging their lips and their lungs, and it's a very visceral experience. And your cheeks are sore after blowing. It's a difficult experience, and you feel it in your body.
Sorry to interrupt. Is that a musical instrument or a horn or shell?
It's a horn. It's a horn. It's typically a ram's horn. Very, very ancient practice, prepared still in a very traditional way. So there's one side of the experience where the person is blowing, the other person is listening. You're hearing this crying, and to engage your sense of hearing this raw sound and being confused by it and shocked by it, and the sense of that the alarm, the awakening that it brings to a person is an interesting one. There are other senses where we engage on a Saturday night. We see the fire. We light a fire on Saturday night to usher in the week where Adam and Eve lit the first fire ever on according to Jewish tradition on Saturday night. And there's a sense where we feel the warmth, we see the fire, we smell fragrance to revive the soul. These are all engaging the senses. But there are some Jewish practices which don't engage any one particular sense of the body, but engage the body in its totality. Mikveh is a good example because it's the whole body is encompassed in that experience. Another good example is the experience of the Sukkah. I'll explain what that is. So the Sukkah is translated as booth or hut, and it commemorates, it's 1 week a year following the Jewish New Year, where we spend the entire week doing whatever we do. We live in this temporary space and temporary dwelling. It's like a thatched roof, which has to be natural. It has to let the rain in. So if it rains, you're getting wet. The walls are just strong enough to hold in some wind, but aren't much stronger than that. And it's a very raw experience, being in this liminal space between our homes and nature, with just the barest protections that we have. And the biblical root of this practice is reminding us that when God took us out of Egypt and took us through the desert, God took us through these huts of cloud, is often how they're described, and protected us. And therefore, we leave our homes, our places of comfort, back into a space of discomfort, of insecurity, where we can embrace the vulnerability and realize that it is ultimately God who protects us, even when we think that we're safe in our brick and mortar houses. But what's so beautiful about it is, besides for being aware of the vulnerability that we fundamentally have and the need that we have for God, for nature to sustain and provide for us, which it does in such bounty and graciousness, besides for the realization that our happiness doesn't come from living inside a fancy home, but it comes from being surrounded by the people we love. And we can be happy if we can be happy in a little hut outside of our homes, surrounded by good people and good company and good food and good friends. But then we realize what's really important in life is not what we thought was important, our homes and our careers and our fancy cars, but we could be on the edge of homelessness and still spend a week. And it's a week of happiness, it's a week of celebration.
So you're with other people. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're with other, so it's not a solo.
No. Okay. With friends and with family, and we eat our meals in there, and we study in there, and many Jews sleep in there. It's a fully encompassed experience. The original Talmudic description is Teishu Kein Tidur, that the same way that you would live in your home, you now live in that hut for a week. But the bodily experience, which is very interesting, is that it's often described as one of the few mitzvot that you enter in with your entire body, right? Because into some mitzvot, you only bring your head. You bring your head when you're studying. You bring your legs when you're walking to visit a sick person. You bring your hand when you're giving charity. But when you go into the sukkah, you're going in with your boots, is the expression, with your galoshes, right? And what happens is, because you're there and you're eating and you're sleeping, you're surrounded by the embrace of the Shekhinah, of the sukkah, which holds us in its space. And it's a fully immersive experience, to use a modern term, where our sight and our smell and our vision and our taste and our sitting, and we feel the rain on us. It's a fully immersive experience. And according to many Jewish mystics, we're actually able to feel our entire bodies and all of our bodily sensations fully encapsulated in the divine, in the space of godliness that imbues the sukkah, in the indwelling, in the Shekhinah inside the sukkah. And it's a very interesting practice, which I think really needs to be experienced, because we think about changing our minds through logic and through processes of reasoning. But what we now know from contemporary science is that we change ourselves by enacting these full and lived embodied changes, right? Going to spend an entire week in nature, out of a comfort zone, in a new setting, that is totally transformative. And that's something which happens with not just the mind, not just any part of the body, but with the totality of our body. And that's a second practice which comes up, which we're going to be commemorating not too long from now.
I really like that. I've never come across any, I've heard of people going out into nature or, the wilderness, but to do it in a kind of minimalistic hut kind of environment where you're kind of relinquishing all the normal furniture and all the normal creature comforts and making yourself open to some degree of suffering. But it's quite unique that it's done in a kind of hut with other people. I've never heard of anything quite like that before. You get fasting in lots of traditions and what else? Forms of yoga or forms of exercise where you're physically exerting, but this kind of living in a. And how often is that? Just once a year, is it? Or
it's 1 week, once a year, and it's very interesting because it's not. It sounds almost like it's an ascetic experience, right? We're leaving our creature comfort, which is true, and yet it's a week of festivity and of joyousness and of singing and of celebration. It's something which challenges most conceptions of what religious practice looks like, where we're either doing something which is solemn and depriving ourselves of comfort, or we're doing something which is joyous and celebratory. Here, it's this very fascinating intermingling of both of them happening together. And as I said, the notion that real happiness, real fulfillment comes when we're not surrounded by all of our comforts is a real eye opener. And it's really important to remember that every year that the things that are really important in life are the things that surround us here in this tiny bare hut, which is our health, our family, our friends, our spirit. And that's a really, really, really important realization. That's a embodied realization, I think.
Very community building and family building by the sounds of it.
Yeah,
as well as strengthening for the individual. Wow, so much to contemplate. Thank you. So where do you so Seekers of Unity? Where do you hope your project, or where do you plan for your project to go over the next few years? Do you have a kind of focus, or because how long has it been running now, and is it evolving?
Yeah. It's evolving all the time. It's something which is alive and beyond me, which is so much fun to see. It's been active now for about 2 years in terms of actual content creation and production. Of course, there was a few years of preparation before beginning to share in this way. Part of the beauty of it is that I have no idea where it's heading, and we're in this dance together where it can constantly surprise me, and the relationships that from the people that reach out and get involved and join the community and bring their own passion and their own inspiration, their own vision, their own creativity, is something which is always changing, because it's alive and taking in new things. So I very much don't have a 6-month plan, a 2-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. My hope is really just to continue to explore that which unites us. My focus, of course, is within the realm of philosophy, religion, metaphysics, the arts, but as well including the sciences and psychology and anything that can be used to unite us, and to really create a space in the community for people who have this shared passion, not so much like-minded, because we're not looking for conformity and a hive mind and for everyone just to create another echo chamber. We want people to really be able to disagree and to bring their own ideas to the table, but to be shared, to have the shared spirit and the shared vision towards a unified world, towards a world where my own identity does not stop at the boundaries of my physical body, but go so much further and go beyond me. And so where it's heading, I really have no idea. We have a lot of exciting projects coming up. I'm living currently in the Holy Land, and we have a series we've began to film of trying to visit all of the religious minorities here in this very small and very conflicted country, to try to find that which unites us both on a human level and also on a spiritual, on a metaphysical, on a godly level. So these are all projects that are undergoing all the time, bringing this new conversation forward, bringing this new community forward. So I probably have as good as idea of where it's heading as you or anyone else does.
Wonderful, wonderful sort of core to what you're doing, though, which is finding that which unites. And to hear today from you about, it's almost not really a dichotomy or an enigma really, but the fact that we can go into our body and to really feel our body in order to support this, connection with the outside world. So it's not, critics may say of body focused practice that it's just navel gazing and it's very selfish. But actually, from what I hear from you, is that it's enriching in terms of appreciating the world around us, appreciating our family, appreciating our food, and so on. So great stuff. I wish you all the best. And we've gone over an hour, and we're coming up to an hour and a quarter. So I'm conscious of the time. Is there anything else you'd like to any other messages you'd like to provide before we wind up?
Yeah, I want to end with maybe one final idea, which may be challenging for some people, and I'll keep it brief. And that may help with the challenge without really spelling it out. We speak a lot about spirituality, spiritual practices, which is a word which I use quite sparingly. And the reason I use it sparingly is because spirit is a word which is part of a binary pair, which is the other side of the binary is matter, right? Mm-hmm. When we speak about spirituality, we speak about it as oppositional to materiality. And what we're doing is we're creating a separation there. And in the spirit of unity, I think it's important to be careful of our language and our thought patterns and our practices, where we're not separating ourselves from materiality, but we're allowing ourselves to unite with the material, to unite the spirit and matter, which is why I use the word mystical almost always instead of spiritual. In seldom cases, I'll use spiritual when I'm talking about something internal because of just the grammar of that. But the reason why I do that is because a lot of religion is predicated on a dichotomy and separation between spirit and matter, between God and world, between soul and body. And I think that the mystics, in their maturest formulations, tell us that duality, that separation of body and soul, is also an illusion. I want to end with one quote here from Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi in a book that he wrote called Toldos Yaakov Yosef, which was the first book of Hasidic mysticism ever written back in the 1800s. And I'm going to read this. It's 3 sentences, and maybe leave it at that, and let this idea percolate in people's minds for themselves. He writes like this. He quotes the very last verse in the book of Psalms, Psalm 150, verse 6. Kol neshama tahallel hallel. Let every breath, every soul praise you, God. And he writes that with every breath, the soul wants to exit the body. But he says this is not the case for the one who makes their corporeality spiritual, who turns their chomer, their materiality, into tsura, into their spiritual. This person, he says, who has achieved this, has achieved a life of peace. A chayim shel shalom. Shalom in Hebrew means peace, but it also means completion, totality. There's a unity there. That is, there is no longer any distinction between body and soul. That corporeality itself has been overcome, and through it continues to exist. It is noteworthy that this is built in the very last verse of Psalms, to say that this is the telos, this is the final aim of all human existence, to see ourselves as not body and soul, but body, soul as one united. And I think that is a big theological shift, which is hitting the fan. and
when you say
we'll end with
a theological shift that's hitting the fan, what do you mean by that? You mean it will challenge a lot of people who've studied theology, or? Yeah,
so I think for 2,000 years of theology, we spoke about the necessity to elevate the soul above the body, that the work of the spiritual and godly life is to place one's emphasis on the soul and at the neglect and the expense. The body is the enemy of the spirit, and we have to raise the spirit up. And therefore we engage in self-mortification, in self-flagellation, in fasting to try to suppress the body so that the spirit can rise up to God. And Yaakov Yosef says no. He says that the ultimate vision of someone who lives in a chayim shel shalom, in a life of completion, of peace, is to understand that their body and soul, their body and spirit are not two separate things at all. They're really one thing. And the fact that we call them two different things is really just part of this game that we play of creating illusions. The notion, the shift for theology to no longer understand the body and soul as two separate things, as two oppositional things, but to see them really as one thing, where there is no soul that is not body and there's no body that isn't soul. I think that's the big coming, the big next thing in theology. Let's hope.
Great, I really like that, and there's a parallel there with the discussion that's going on in physics or quantum physics about consciousness and this upward causation or downward causation. Does consciousness arise from matter, or is consciousness fundamental and matter has arisen through the act of consciousness in different forms? And maybe there's no separation there. Maybe they rely on each other, and as I believe it in is it the Kabbalah, or there's this idea that you have to have some kind of involution or space created in order for anything to know it exists. So could you say that's the beginning of matter, and that the two rely on each other, possibly?
Yeah. So there definitely is a metaphysics that explain where matter perceptually comes into existence, and what you're referring to is the idea of tzimtzum, where there's a space, there's an illusion of space that's created. And part of that illusion is the separation of what we refer to as light and vessel, right? Energy and matter, the keli and ur in Hebrew. But the fundamental realization is that they're really not two separate things at all. That's all only on this operating system. But if we can get to a life of peace, chaim shel shalom, we can see how fundamentally, really, they're one. And our narratives are just ways of trying to understand how those things are one. And that may not be a simple task, and it may not be up for everyone, but it is something which we can begin to think about and begin to feel into.
Certainly, absolutely. Why not? Why not even just spend a few moments exploring the idea?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Zevi. And
thank you.
As we wind up, what's the is there a handle, or where's the best? You can just search Seekers of Unity on YouTube to find you. Is there any other way that people can find your work and your excellent lessons and teachings?
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, all the material right now, it's available in many places, but the primary place is on YouTube, and that's Seekers of Unity. There's the website seekersofunity.com, and that has links to the material as well. But it's centralized on the channel, so that's where people can get in on the action. And please do come by and please say hi and get involved in the community. If you come, don't just be a silent observer, but come and share your wisdom and share your thoughts. We love when people come and become a voice in the family. So that's the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.